Story begins in 1945 when Army soldiers are coming back home after World War II. When their ship lands on port, the wives of all married soldiers were there to receive them. After that, we see a man named Paul. His friend says to him that, "Do you remember your wife's face?" His friend asks him such a question because Paul had to go to war on the very next day of his marriage. When they reach port, all soldiers' wives have come there to receive them, but Paul's wife Betty isn't there, and his home is in San Francisco. After reaching home, Paul asks his wife, "Why did you not come to port to receive me?" Betty says to him that she didn't know that he was coming. However, Paul used to write a letter to her every day, but after some time, Betty had stopped reading the letters, and she had kept all those letters in a food locker without reading them. On this, Paul gets a little angry with Betty, but then, forgetting all that, he wants to live a happy life with his wife, and he wants to spend his life in a good way from scratch. But Betty says to Paul that you should start your previous business of selling chocolates, and Paul agrees with her. The very next day, he sets off to Sacramento where there is work. And there, Paul does not have any idea that this train will change his life. Then, when Paul starts his journey, there he meets a girl whose name is Victoria. Victoria is a graduate student and belongs to a Mexican-American family. But then there is turbulence in the train, and Paul falls on Victoria. Their tickets get exchanged. Paul tries to go to his seat after saying sorry to her, but at the same time, Victoria vomits on Paul's army dress. After that, Paul gets off at the next station and gets on the bus. Victoria is also present there. Paul gets very happy after seeing Victoria there, and Victoria also becomes very happy seeing him there. After that, when the bus starts moving, two thugs also get onto it, and they bother Victoria, but Paul teaches them a good lesson and beats them, and all the three are made to get off the bus. Paul does not reach Sacramento even, and all that has happened to him, and therefore Paul decides to go to Sacramento on foot, but when he walks a short distance, he finds Victoria crying. Paul asks Victoria, "What happened?" Here, Victoria tells him that she is pregnant, and this baby belongs to Professor, and now Professor is not with her. Family is very conservative, and if she will go home without his husband, his father will kill her. But here, Paul says that he is your father, he will understand you definitely. But Victoria refuses this clearly because it is a very serious situation for Victoria. Then Paul suggests to her an idea that he will go to her home with her faking as his husband, and he will stay there one day and will go out from there quietly the next day, which will make everyone think that he has left Victoria, and gradually everything will be fine. Then you will be on your way and I will be on my way. At first, Victoria refuses to accept this idea, but viewing this situation, she agrees to it. And now she says sorry for all the things which Paul will have to suffer because of her, and says thanks in advance for future help. And then both of them start walking towards Victoria's house. Victoria's house was in the Napa Valley where their family had a huge vineyard. Then Paul gives her a ring from his chocolate box before reaching Victoria's house, and he also wears a ring, so that no one would doubt them. Then when they both reach home, we get to know that this father is very strict, just as she told him. He scolds Victoria a lot for marrying without telling him. Dad's name is Alberto. He says to Victoria that you have destroyed the name of your parents and the whole family. And when the whole family comes to know that Paul has a small business selling chocolates, they all get shocked because there was a huge difference between Paul and Victoria's family status. But Victoria's father, Don Pedro, welcomes him and also eats his chocolate. And he becomes very happy after eating that chocolate. Now, when the whole family starts having dinner, at that time, Alberto asks Paul and Victoria a few questions, and both of them answer those questions accurately. Now Alberto asks Paul that, where is his family? Then in the answer to that question, Paul says that he is an orphan. Then Alberto says sarcastically to Paul that he wanted to marry her daughter to a Mexican boy who belonged to a well-off family. Alberto insults Paul so much that Paul leaves without having dinner. And here, Paul has a problem. He sometimes immerses in fond memories of the war which make him upset, and he can't forget them even if he wants to, and those memories make him feel very lonely. After Paul comes out like this, Victoria also comes after him, and here Victoria asks Paul not to mind her father's words. Paul says that if he had been in his place, he would have done the same. He can understand father's feelings. That's why Paul does not mind Alberto's words. Now, after that, when Paul is preparing to sleep on the ground at night, Alberto comes to say goodnight to them at the request of his wife. And before Alberto comes to their room, Paul pretends to be Victoria's husband, but Alberto sees the sleeping mat on the floor, but he leaves without saying a word. Now at the same night, when grapes begin to freeze because of the weather getting colder, Victoria's family burns fire at every place and conveys its warmth to the trees in a special way. Now during that, Paul and Victoria feel something for each each other, but understanding the situation of each other, they ignore them. Then the next day, when Paul is about to leave Victoria's house, as they had planned, Victoria's grandfather, Don Pedro, talks to Paul. He introduces those holy trees to him. They have a very old tree there about which Don Pedro tells Paul. Here, Don Pedro tells him that this tree is at the place of God for them. The same tree has made this valley so magnificent and green. He forces Paul to stay for that day and help them in cutting. Paul cannot refuse him as he insists on him so much, so he stays there. After that, when Victoria sees Paul, she becomes very happy. Then when Paul starts cutting with the family, he feels a different feeling of peace. He feels very good with them. He enjoys a lot in growing their grapes and making wine. Paul is very happy that day, and while making wine from grapes, Paul and Victoria come so close to each other and make a passionate kiss. Then Paul expresses his love to Victoria, but he is not free. He is tightened in the ties of relationships. After that, Paul decides to leave from there. But then he sees Victoria in pain, because here she was having pregnancy pains. That's why Paul decides to stay there for some time. But Victoria says to him that, "Can you stay here with me for your whole life?" But Paul could not answer that question, and he feels himself so much helpless at that moment. After that, Paul has an argument with Alberto about Victoria because Alberto thinks that Paul is making him away from Victoria. Then, when Paul is about to go from there after that little argument, Don Pedro stops him to drink brandy with him, and then he asks him that how much Victoria is important for him. After that, obeying Don Pedro, Paul goes towards Victoria's house singing. But when Victoria does not come out of home, he goes out from there angrily, and here he gets very sad. And when Paul meets Victoria the next day during the Harvest Festival, then Alberto announces Paul and Victoria's marriage in front of all, and he says that during the festival they will be remarried. Now, hearing that announcement, Paul decides to tell the truth to Alberto, but forbidding him, Victoria tells the truth to everyone herself and faces that truth, and she tells her father, Alberto, all the truth. We see that all has ended in this scene. Paul and Victoria have separated now, and Alberto is also very angry with them. Then Paul goes back to his house in San Francisco. When he reaches home, he comes to know that Betty has an affair with someone. Here, Betty says to Paul that she was about to tell him all the truth. Here, Betty tells him that she has filed an annulment to end her marriage legally. Then, taking the papers of annulment, Paul goes out from there without saying anything. But here, Betty feels sad about him, and she has deceived him, and now she feels sorry to him for all that. Paul quietly leaves without getting angry and saying anything, and he doesn't get angry here because he's very happy inside, because he also wanted to get separation from Betty. After that, Paul does not look here and there and goes towards Napa Valley directly. And there in the valley, Alberto is very worried about Victoria, and he is quite angry with Paul. Now when Paul comes in front of Alberto, here Alberto shouts at him and says, "What are you here for?" Paul says that he loves Victoria and now he is not married. Now Alberto says that, "Do you know that she is pregnant and that child is not yours? Do you still love her?" Now after hearing their words, all other family members also come there. Meanwhile, Alberto throws a lantern and beats Paul, but that lantern doesn't hit Paul. Instead, it hits the trees, which immediately starts a fire there. Paul and all others try very hard to put out the fire, but by morning, the whole valley is burning to ashes. Alberto and all others are very sad and broken, but meanwhile, Paul uproots that traditional tree and gives it to Alberto. Seeing it, Alberto tells him that this tree is still alive. At this time, everyone's sadness turns into happiness, as they have gotten their lives back. Now Alberto is very emotional and apologizes to all of them and puts Victoria's hand in Paul's hand happily. In a short time, this valley becomes green again, and Paul lives with Victoria happily, and this movie ends here.